Good? Okay. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out in this kind of cold and rainy spring day, spring evening, to the library here. I want to thank, first of all, before I introduce our speaker and have our program kind of get underway, I just want to give everybody a quick overview of why we're doing this and who we are, Art4C. First of all, I want to thank the library here in Long Branch. Lisa Kelly has been a tremendous supporter of what we wanted to do here, and you can tell the facility here is fantastic for this. It's got nice space for displaying artwork and for having exhibits and having live events. So Art4C is almost a year old. It's going to be a year on the day that the plastic bag mandate goes into effect in New Jersey, where you can no longer get a plastic bag at a grocery store, May 4th. We are now about 50 artists deep in terms of donated artwork. For those of you that don't know much about us, we are a fundraising organization for ocean conservation. We chose to support the Littoral Society this year, Clean Ocean Action, the Baykeeper, and the Wetlands Institute. And the way we do that is we raise money through donated artwork that, as you can see on the walls here, have, in this case, been donated by 23 artists. We have 28 pieces here, and all of this is for sale. And we basically do workshops and do lectures and try to educate not only artists, but the general public about what's happening with the ocean. And I'll tell you, there's always something new to learn, right? So tonight we are very much pleased to present Tim Dillingham, who is the executive director for the Littoral Society, and Wendy Green, who is a teacher out at the Marine Academy of Science and Technology out in Mass, the Sandy Hook location, is going to introduce Tim. And so I'll bring Wendy up here. Wendy is on my board for Art4C. She's been a tremendous add to that. Before Wendy reads or introduces Tim's bio, I just want to tell you that we have a survey here tonight that is very important to us. We are trying to understand the public's feelings about offshore wind. And as many of you know, New Jersey has approved offshore wind development in the ocean here, what's called the New York-New Jersey Bight area. And a lot of people think it's good news, and some people think it's not so good news. And I think the public is learning about this. And so we're interested to know what your level of understanding of this is and what your thoughts are. So if you wouldn't mind, after signing in or maybe after the lecture tonight, feel free to answer the questionnaire. It can be anonymous, it doesn't matter. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy for introducing him.
All right, Tim, come on over so they can at least see you while I do this.
That's what you're talking about.
Tim has led the American Littoral Society as its exec director since 2003. His work has led to expanded advocacy regarding the restoration of Barnegat Bay and other coastal areas, a comprehensive program of habitat restoration and resiliency on Delaware Bay, new partnerships to promote community-based restoration projects, expansion of the marine education programs in underserved communities throughout New Jersey, increased public access to the coast, and the use of nature-based approaches to increasing coastal resiliency in the face of changing climate. In 2017, he co-chaired a legislative task force examining public access to tidal waters, which led to the adoption of state legislation strengthening the protection of the public trust doctrine and advancing its implementation. He is currently the co-chair of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee on Aquaculture and Red Knots, the Coastal Resiliency Collaborative, and a founding board member of Restore America's Estuaries. Welcome, Tim.
Oh, great. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Sue. Thanks to all of you all for coming out and having me. It's really great. We really appreciate Art4C's work and their support of our work. We're a nonprofit charitable organization, so we what was it, the Tennessee Williams line, right? We depend on the goodwill of others to do our work. And the Littoral Society, if you don't know us, the word littoral means of or along the coastline. And we work on beaches and in the estuaries where the rivers meet the sea, wetlands. We're very oriented towards marine wildlife, its habitats. We have in our mission statement, we have a charge to defend the coast from harm. So we have a litigation program where we will take people to court that are either polluting or violating the law. Sometimes that's the government, sometimes that's industry. And then we very much believe that we have an obligation to empower others to do the same type of work, right? Recognizing that even Margaret Mead saying about, never doubt that a small group of dedicated people can change the world, even acknowledging that we want to have a lot of people change the world because the scale of the challenges that we face are so great. And particularly climate change, which I'm going to speak a little bit about tonight, and some of the work that we're doing to try to respond to the pressures that climate change place on the ocean, place on the coastline in particular. Let's see, I won't spend a lot of time on climate change itself because I think that most folks have a sense of the magnitude of climate change and what it represents. It really is an existential threat to people's existence, to our society, to at least the way we live now. It is fundamentally altering the mechanics of the planet. When you look at the oceanographic information about the changes in currents, changes in sea temperatures, the changes in distribution of fish because of the change in temperatures, those are really fundamental aspects of the way that the world works, and we are fooling around with that. So we are unfortunately, I think, burdened with a legacy of what we've already done over the last 150 years. So there is a certain amount of carbon and the impacts of climate change baked into the climate already. So we will have to learn to live with the consequences of that, which is a little bit about what this talk is about tonight. This is really not a great graph, but it really, the idea here is that because of more heat going into the ocean, and the ocean is really, I think, the underappreciated victim in climate change, if you want to look at it that way. That people don't think about the impacts on the ocean as much, except in sea level. So the heat, most of the heat that's generated is going into the ocean, being taken up. There's thermal expansion, right? Water, when it gets hot, expands. There's changes in other aspects of the oceanography of the ocean, but so sea levels are rising. And when we relate this back to our own lives, what we see is that more people are at risk in more buildings because we haven't been very smart about the way that we live along the coastline. So there's more and more folks that are going to be in that danger zone, at risk of annual flooding. If you look at where the sea levels were in 1980 to compared to today. But from my perspective, we like to we don't deal as much with the buildings and with the infrastructure and with the impacts to roads. A lot of things that you hear focused on when people talk about climate change. We're worried about the habitats, right? From our perspective, it's parochial, but that's what we're here to do from the organization's perspective. Dunes, intertidal areas, horseshoe crabs down in Delaware Bay. There really are amazing, often irreplaceable resources that give a lot of things to society that, again, probably use this term a lot, underappreciated, right? There's ecosystem services, not only the processing of heat and chemicals and nutrients throughout the system, but just fisheries. And think about all the towns in New Jersey that are based around fisheries and grew up around fish. The habitat is the home in which animals live, and that occurs, that's both the physical structure along the shoreline, but also the chemical and other aspects of what influences. So that's part of where we focus on the Littoral Society, when we focus on this work about thinking about climate change and how to deal with that part of it that we're already experiencing. Again, fish and wildlife. These are herring, horseshoe crabs, barnacles on top of oysters there, and the red knots that Wendy mentioned. I don't know if you don't know. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, so to speak, about these birds because I do a lot of work around red knots. But these birds are amazing. They fly from the tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, up to the Arctic, which is where they breed, and they stop in the Delaware Bay. certain parts of that trip, usually from Brazil to the Delaware Bay, can often be one hop, one flight, nonstop. This bird is the size of a robin, and so it's really tremendous. They are ecologically linked to the horseshoe crabs. The reason they stop in the Delaware Bay is that the horseshoe crabs in New Jersey has the highest concentration of horseshoe crabs in the world in Delaware Bay. When they come up on the beach to lay their eggs, those eggs are rich in proteins and fats, and so it's great fuel for a bird that's just flown in from the tip of South America, right? I always think there's like a natural version of the sign that says "Last exit on Turnpike," because that's what they stumble over. But anyways, it's really amazing, and unfortunately, the horseshoe crabs were overfished in the early '90s, really badly, to the point that the red knots are now on the endangered species list, which is a terrible thing, but I would say something I'm very proud of, because I did a lot of work on getting that to happen. So now in New Jersey we have a moratorium on horseshoe crabs. You can't catch them for bait anymore, and we're working on, as you'll see, recovery of the red knots. But these are resources that are affected by climate change as well. And then ultimately it's about us, right? And as much as people would sometimes like to think they can separate themselves from nature, we can't. And from my perspective, you shouldn't want to, because there's a tremendous beauty and wonder in nature, as well as a sort of more utilitarian things that nature provides to us. But so when we do this work that I'm going to describe to you, we are trying to protect the habitats themselves, protect the wildlife, and then protect the communities themselves. So that idea of resilience is both the idea of how do we reduce our risk, how do we make ourselves less likely to be harmed by climate, by storms, by sea level rise, but also how do we bounce back quicker, right? Because hurricanes are a way of life. We all know that. We all have been through a number of them, unfortunately, but they are part of the system. So if we're going to live in places that we're subject to that, we want to make ourselves, I think, as safe as possible, live as much in harmony with the coast as we can, and be able to bounce back from the storms that inevitably will come to us. I always like to say, I wish we learned more about how to live with the coast and not on the coast. And a lot of that's fueled by this idea that nature protects us, right? These are, and a lot of this really started to come into focus after Hurricane Sandy, when so many people got hurt so badly. But we started to really think about quantifying things, right? And almost, part of this I dislike, because I don't like to monetize nature, but there is, you can do that, and you can look at, how much a single marsh can generate in terms of seafood that might ultimately make its way into market. You can think about the fact that coral reefs can provide, coastal protection from flooding, that the salt marshes that, are along our coastline are a barrier to waves and to storms, and so help protect our communities. Same things with mangroves and oyster reefs. So in the program work that we do, we have an education program, we have a conservation program, which is very, very heavily oriented towards habitat restoration. But we also do a lot of work around trying to protect the resource, before it becomes degraded, before it becomes in trouble. So we work on dunes, we work on beaches, salt marshes. Fish passage is the idea of taking away the barriers like dams. We have a project down in Wreck Pond. If you've ever been to Spring Lake, there's a big culvert there now that we built right after the hurricane that allows the river herring to come up into Wreck Pond, which are where they traditionally spawned. When they rebuilt the beaches and started to seal that off on a permanent basis, the herring didn't have a place to go back to. And herring are what they call anadromous fish. They return to where they were born, right to spawn. If they can't get upstream, it's not a good sight. In fact, if you know where the lake, the dam at Shadow Lake is, at least it used to, I haven't been there in a while, but it used to be about this time of year, a little bit later, you could see the herring bumping up against the shad, right, up against the dam, trying to get back to where they wanted to be. So in doing that, we not only try to provide ecological uplift to put some of that ecological value back into these natural systems, but we want to improve the community resiliency. And then lastly, but not least, is we want to inform and involve and engage the public on these projects because, one, as I said earlier, we don't believe we can do it all on our own, but really the only thing that's going to change in our relationship is if we change our relationship. So we want people to be stewards, to help, I'll show you some pictures, rebuild the oyster reefs, rebuild these fish ladders, rebuild the sand dunes, and really have a stake in this, and come to love it in a way that they want to protect it. Case in point, this is our Earth Day. We have a program where we call it beach grasses in classes. We go out into the schools. I know some of you are young enough that you may have been through this program, but and we give the kids a culm or a stalk of beach grass, which around this time of year is brown, right? And they hang on to it, not this time, a little bit earlier, they hang on to it until it greens up, and then on Earth Day they come out and they replant the dunes on Sandy Hook. So these are just some examples. We try to call these practices nature-based, right? So to a certain extent, when we're trying to recreate the barriers or hold the shoreline edges in place or restore those habitats right along the edge, we want to mimic nature as much as we can, right? So we're using, this is core, which is a coconut fiber, soft approach there. Actually using sills here of oyster shell to allow that marsh to revegetate, building breakwaters. And then we don't use these are from some colleagues of mine down south, but these are other approaches of sort of more man-made reef balls and that type of thing. And really it's all about the edge and it's all about vegetation, right? If you think about so much of New Jersey's shoreline is bulkheaded, right? We've come in an attempt to keep the land in place. And what happens is that hard structure, which is usually vertical, reflects all the energy that comes into it from the water, right? And it starts to scour out. And so those shallow areas that used to be vegetated, that used to be have salt marshes in them or just little shallow areas or very important habitats, those get lost. And of course, what we found, if the storm is big enough, that the bulkheads don't hold and they're very expensive to replace. So this idea of living shorelines as a way of controlling erosion, as a way of adapting to again, more energy, more pressure, more sea level rise along the shoreline. It's, you kind of want to do this dope slap thing sometimes because you think about, at least I do, streams that have been there forever, right? And they flood and they shift and rivers shift. If you ever read about the Mississippi in particular, how it moves around. But it's always there, right? In its essence, in all the natural things that it does to provide habitat, to provide flooding storage. Even if it moves a little bit and it's dynamic, it's still there. That doesn't happen when you harden the edge. And in New Jersey, we pay a very high price for the idea that we can keep all the houses that we have along the edge of the beaches, right? We have billions of dollars of beach nourishment because that's a dynamic environment. My predecessor at the Littoral Society used to say that a beach is a place that sand stops on its way to somewhere else. It's always moving. And so the idea of trying to hold it in place is just counter to its nature. So again, this idea of living shorelines as a way of not losing some of those natural values, perhaps striking maybe an imperfect compromise about keeping the shoreline edge in a way that helps protect communities, helps protect property. But also has these other benefits, right? Flood mitigation, habitat. To a lot of us, it looks better than a bulkhead, right? carbon sequestration, which is this idea of taking carbon either out of the atmosphere or out of the water and binding it up in the soil. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then adaptability. Again, there's some dynamism, some flexibility, some ability to change built into the natural edge that you recreated in these living shorelines. It's not there when you harden it through riprap or bulkheads. Just to touch on this for a second, because this is again, Sue mentioned the windmills, right? And the idea that fundamentally windmills are about displacing fossil fuel generated electricity with wind generated electricity, right? So it's called mitigation. They're trying to mitigate the impacts of carbon going into the atmosphere. The sort of the flip side of that coin that doesn't get talked about as much is, let's try to take carbon out of the atmosphere. Some of that carbon that's already there. And we have these really well-designed machines called trees and plants that do that as a natural function. So increasingly, again, when people are, with governments in particular, are thinking about how do we respond to climate, right? How do we mitigate the ongoing impacts of fossil fuels that are either being burned or the carbon that's still in the atmosphere, and how do we adapt? We find that not only can we deal with the erosion and the storm impacts along the shoreline edge, but that these plants will take up carbon and help mitigate the impacts of the present carbon pollution that's there. So the greenhouse gases, they're taken in, they're sequestered by, and then used in the natural processes that are again in the coastal systems. This is about as sciencey as I get. So just to show you, so where that process happens, right? The carbon dioxide, seagrasses, down in Barnegat Bay, we have submerged aquatic vegetation, the plants along the shoreline itself, the salt marshes. And the carbon comes out of the atmosphere. It's either stored in the plants themselves, or it's sometimes fixed and put into the soil. And this is just to give you, again, this is my parochialism about coastal systems, right? But people understand, I think, that rainforests and forests take up carbon, right? That's. But if you look at these are soil carbon accumulation rates. So these are like a comparison of different types of plants and how well they take up that carbon and store it in the soil, right? Seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes are all much higher than the terrestrial systems. And it's not that it's a competition, but that we don't tend to give as much attention. And if we don't give as much attention to it, then we still allow tidal marshes to be filled to build highways or houses. We don't take care of them. New Jersey still loses a lot of salt marsh, particularly along the Delaware Bay, where most of it occurs, just in natural processes. And when you lose that, all that carbon that's going into that soil, when it gets busted up because of wave action, it all gets released back into the atmosphere, right? So the value, so to speak, that's big gain there gets lost. Anyways, this is just again. There's still a lot of draining of wetlands in the United States. Ironically, New Jersey, as built out as it is, right, has very progressive laws. If you go out west to the Midwest, there's still very little regulation of wetlands. Farmers still till them under. In the last administration, there was a decision called the Water of the United States, in which they were trying to redefine wetlands out of existence, in essence, based on some legal principles about navigable waters and whether the federal government had an issue. But anyways, you can just see the magnitude of how much, if you want to think about it in terms of equivalence to coal being burned, right? A million tons of carbon dioxide is equal to a billion pounds of coal burned. So wetlands erosion and lost open water, we're losing 7 million tons of carbon per year. So still, very, very significant. issue, which argues for why we ought to be paying attention to wetlands. But there's I always like to think about the answers to these problems. And there's some quote-unquote low-hanging fruit, things that are relatively easy to do. Protect the wetlands that we have already. In New Jersey, we've lost 50% of what was here when the Europeans first showed up. Half of it's gone. And so we ought to protect what's left and build upon that if we can. Reconnect, impounded waters, re-wetting, drain organic soil, right? So farmland often gets drained. If you look at ditches, farmers use these called tiles at times to take the water off the land. We could re-wet those and get the capacity of those soils to take up carbon back in place. And then the restoration, the actual physical restoration of the wetlands themselves. Okay, so here are some things that we're doing here in New Jersey. This is just a little montage of programs, but I talked about the fact we build oyster reefs. These are bags of whelk shell that we're going to use to build breakwaters down. We have used to build breakwaters down the Delaware Bay, or dunes recreation. We have a project we call Operation Oyster, which works up in the Navesink and Shrewsbury Rivers. That's the fish passage down in Spring Lake I was talking to you about, and then just fish. So we have a very wide-ranging set of projects, and part of what we try to do is we're not only trying to add some value to the places that we're working, right, restore the habitats there, but we're also trying to demonstrate that this can be done. Because when we, historically have gone to public decision makers, whether those are the state or the feds, and we often get that, well, you can't do that, or it can't be done. So this is sort of like, well, we're going to show you that it can be done, right? We can restore beaches, we can do oyster reefs, marshes, and then we try to do them around the state because there's just a little bit of difference in all the waters of the state, right? The Delaware Bay is different than Barnegat Bay, which is different than Raritan Bay, which is different than the Atlantic Ocean. So we try to do them in a way that we're demonstrating their proof of concept or demonstration projects. We think a lot about the water coming in from the ocean, right? Sea level rise, big storms. But one of the consequences of climate change is changes in precipitation, right? Sort of like that rainstorm we just had. Rainstorms are getting flashier, like lots of water over a very short period of time as opposed to being stretched out. Changes in the frequency of it happening. And that's really important for a place like New Jersey, which has lots and lots of hard surfaces, right? We've paved over the natural lands, the forests, the ground that used to soak that water up. So some of the work we're doing is about what we call green infrastructure and rain gardens. And these are usually fairly small scale things, but we're trying to, again, look at where people can do them in their own backyards. There's a program down in Bridgeton and Millville down in Cumberland County down in the south where we work with the schools. This actually, I turned to the name of the school, but this was an area that constantly flooded and just, always had water standing on it. So we came in, you excavate this out, you amend the soil just like you would in a garden, right, to make it more porous at the bottom, and then you plant plants that love water in there. I don't think we did any grading here, but sometimes the land is graded to take the water to those places. And these are just some kids that are raising the plants in the school. What we did is we connected the school programs to the projects, right? So the kids are helping to do the projects themselves, and then they're learning about it in the school programs. And one of the neat things about this down there is that there's still agricultural programs, right? There's still kids that are studying to be farmers down in South Jersey, and so we've been, kind of working into some of that program. Again, rain gardens at sort of your backyard level. Increasingly, as places redevelop, they're starting to think about stormwater parks, right? So how do you take the water, as the waterfronts are being redeveloped? and manage it more consciously so that, again, we're avoiding those things like houses being flooded, the really terrible things that happened with Ida. It's a long ways off because we have 350 years or 300 years of development, right, where we didn't think about any of these things. But now we're going back. And if you really want to see human ingenuity at work, check into what Hoboken has done. If anybody remembers how badly Hoboken got hit during Sandy, right? Just some brilliant people that have been working on this. Actually, a young man who lives in Highlands and commutes up by ferry to Hoboken. He's in charge of this, but they've rebuilt the city so that there are now underground storage places where the stormwater goes into. They've elevated parts of it. They've turned parts of it that traditionally flooded into parks so that there's no damage. When they build now, they bring all the generators and everything up off the first floor, right? So it's really a showcase as to what can be done to minimize our risk and to make ourselves more resilient. And I would say, this is not the last landscape, right? Look, I'm 61 years old, so I've seen the development patterns change, right? And so if we accept that someone's going to come along probably and rebuild once again in some new way, and maybe after the next storm, because the last storm, lots of people rushed right back into the same places, that we ought to be smarter about how we do it. And I think, Hoboken's got a lot of great things going for it that make it a little bit, not quite the case study, but I think they show it can be done. They can be done in a way that still makes it an attractive place for people to come and live. So down the Delaware Bay, this is a series of projects. These were really related back to the red knots and the horseshoe crabs, as well as this idea of resiliency. When Sandy came through here, it took all the sand that was on the beaches and tossed it back into the salt marshes. And I think the next picture, yeah. So you can see, here's what the beaches looked like right after the storm, right? And this is really the worst. These are old peat beds. These are historic coastal wetlands. And so what we were really concerned about at the time was the ability of the horseshoe crabs to come up and spawn before the red knots came back. And so we came in, you remember the storm was obviously in the end of October, 10 years ago. We had to get this done. The timing on this is that the horseshoe crabs start to come up in late April or mid-April, depending on the water temperature, May, and the birds come in May, June, right? So we went in and we were able to rebuild these beaches. You see what they look like after we came in. And we did in the same way. It was kind of a funny place for me to be as an environmentalist, to be doing exactly what the Army Corps of Engineers does out here, which has a lot of problems environmentally to it. But when we did, we used the same techniques here to be able to get it back. And since we've continued this program over the years, we find now that the horseshoe crabs really love our beaches. We figured out the science part of it, which was how thick the beaches needed to be, what was optimal. Right? The first year we didn't build them thick enough, so there's hydrogen sulfide that comes off of those old peat beds, and it was killing the eggs of the horseshoe crabs. So the beaches weren't as productive, and therefore the birds weren't getting as fat. The goal for the birds when they show up in May is to get themselves to 180 grams, which is really not very big, but I'm lucky enough I get to go down and help band the birds, right? There's a bunch of biologists from around the world who track these animals, and you can hold a really skinny red knot in one hand and a really fat red knot in the other one. You can really feel the difference. But now we know that the horseshoe crabs use the beaches that we restored. The birds are gaining weight faster on the beaches that we've restored because there's more horseshoe crabs there and more eggs, so more food, right? So it just shows that we can solve some of these problems if we can do them well enough at big enough scale. This just gives you an idea, sort of what that looks like, right? And in this case, we're trying to protect this salt marsh. Here's the town. You can't really see it in this picture, but there's the town up here. But these salt marshes were farmed in colonial times up until almost to World War II, someplace a little bit after. But when they used to cut the grasses and use for packing and insulation and all sorts of other things, Well, when they did that, they took a little bit of the soil with them, right? So these wetlands are actually down a little bit below sea level. So we built this beach up both for the horseshoe crabs on the beach part of the habitat, but also to protect the salt marsh for the carbon mitigation values we're talking about. And then this is where we started to innovate with these idea of these oyster reefs, building oyster reefs, because our beaches are no different than anybody else's, right? Our beaches, the sand moves off of them the same way it moves off the beaches here. So the oyster reefs, the beaches all mostly face south, in the prevailing winds in the summertime are south, southwest. So we built these barriers out of whelk shell, and then found out that we were recruiting oysters that were naturally in the water onto them. So we were creating that habitat as well as slowing down the loss of the sand on the beaches, which is good for the birds and good for the horseshoe crabs. In Barnegat Bay is more of a straight up, let's put oysters back in the water. This is Good Luck Point in Forked River Township, well, I'm sorry, Berkeley Township. You know, oysters, individual oysters can filter 50 gallons of water a day, right? And Barnegat Bay's problem is mostly about nutrients, nitrogen that's come off the land, mostly lawn fertilizers. And so there was once, and I don't remember that, I should really get the date down, but something like 12,000 acres of oysters in Barnegat Bay at one point, right? And for a long time was, you know, supported people's living, lots of baymen worked them, had a huge role in the water quality of the bay, and almost all gone. There's some down in the Mullica River area now, but not many left. So this project was really about trying to put those oysters back in a underwater or subtidal site using this whelk shell. This is a terrible site to enter, but this is Slade Dale Preserve. This is in Point Pleasant. You know, nice little nature preserve tucked into lots of development. And you can see, these are not great pictures either, but this is the shoreline. This red line is where the shoreline was in 1930, right? And then you can see green where 1970 versus it. So, you know, again, this erosion happening, loss of the tidal marsh. And what we did is we came in and we built these barriers again using natural methods. These are, the first couple years we did this, we did them with Christmas trees. And we had people donate the Christmas trees, stuck them into the cribs, and it worked really well. Just enough to break up the water energy, to minimize the erosion on the site, on the edges. And then this project we're involved in now is Forked River Beach in Lacey Township. This is the idea here is that here's this community that is on the western side of Barnegat Bay, severe erosion happening. The state came in after Sandy and armored the shoreline, right? Again, that old philosophy, let's keep it in place, that's where they do that. Well, when all that energy bounces off of the gabions, which are boxes of rocks, it churns up all the sediment in the bay, right? So, and this is one of the places where eelgrasses are still there. Grasses, like all plants, require sunlight, right? So if they're on the bottom of the bay, and all of a sudden the water above them, between them and the sun, becomes turbid and cloudy, the SAV, the grasses don't survive anymore. And when you lose them, you lose all the habitat value for fish, turtles, and other things. So the idea here was to come in and mitigate that a bit by building a series of oyster reefs and barriers offshore. This just gives you a sense of what's going on. This is somebody's backyard during a storm. There were a couple tents which actually tried to do the shell bag reefs here. And this was a learning lesson for us, right? Because the energy, the wave energy in Barnegat Bay was so high there that it just busted up the bags. You can see. So we knew we needed to do something a little more creative. So these boxes. So what we've done is we've built this series of oyster reefs, right? And hopefully, if this works, the idea is that it'll break the wave energy up. the waters behind them will become quieter and the grasses will start to expand. There are still fairly large grass beds up here and in here, and then the habitats that were there, as well as the barriers that are provided by the wetlands, by the SAB themselves, will start to add to the protection of the community, as well as, you know, really restore the natural values that were lost when they built these hard rock walls here. It's really sad that terrapins, diamondback terrapins, that try to nest up in here, and every year they come crawling up over this wall. It is kind of, one cool thing though is that they built tunnels for them, and it seems like that the turtles are actually learning to use the tunnels. But we'd like to get it back to a little bit, you know, softer place to live. Monmouth County, you know, again, we always work with lots of partners. And here we're doing, in Shark River Island, this is a project we just did last year. This is a flexible concrete pad, and they placed it on the edge. This is the northwest edge of Shark River Island, where the condos are eroding away badly. The idea was to stabilize this edge and then come in and replant behind it, right, to reestablish the salt marsh that was being left. So this is sort of a mix of hard structures and soft structures. And then up on the, you know, a little further off the beach, the idea of maritime forests, right? If you look at a natural, if you go to Sandy Hook, you see the beach profile, there's a beach, right, then the dune system, then you get a forest system that goes up there. Which we've lost because we, you know, go right up to the edge of the beach in most places. So this is a project to go in and reestablish some of that, native plants in there. It helps control some of the stormwater runoff. And then I guess, so last part of this is just really quickly to go through, again, like I said, we always try to get the community involved. This is a project in Bridgeton where they're going to come in and we're going to come in and build a stormwater park in here. This is part of a redevelopment in a very poor community. And this is a visioning session, right? So we created these opportunities for the community to come in and tell us what they wanted to see, right? What are the aspects of things that they wanted to have? And the number one issue was trash, right? Which I thought, I was really surprised the first time I heard that, but they would say, you know, whatever you do, it's great you're going to control the stormwater and the floods, we're all for that, but you got to figure out how to deal with the trash. And so we actually, you know, recruited some of the local kids and got them to create a little team that tries to take care of this park as we're going forward on it. But these are people, this is down South Reeds Beach on the Delaware Bay. Just folks in the community, we just put the word out, people came out to help us build these oyster reefs, and we have a big party afterwards we call a celebration. And we supply oysters and we supply barbecue and everybody has a good time. But it's really, I you know, 30 years of doing this, I still am amazed and it makes me very happy when you create an opportunity for people to come out and help out, and they almost always do it. This is a project in Vineland. If you know Vineland, it's a very poor town. Cumberland County is the poorest county in the state. This is in a park called GM Petro Park, where they have flooding problems, and we're replanting the corridor around the streams, right? So as a way of helping to take up some of that flood capacity or provide more flood capacity. Again, though, everybody right down to the little kids comes out and helps out. So. In Jamaica Bay, which is in New York City, where we have an office, we created a thing called the Restoration Corps, and it was really started off as a job training program, trying to introduce kids that lived in Queens and Brooklyn to opportunities, you know, to work in science, to work in environmental work, and it's really great. A couple of them have gone on to science and doing things like that. Just another way of getting people involved, right? We had a really great program down in the Delaware Bay. I think we had 14 veterans join us, and that was really. I grew up in a military family, so I have a soft spot for vets, and I mean, they're just like on the job, right? Tell us what we need to do, get it done, and we trained them ultimately to do all sorts of scientific work. They were taking elevations of the beaches, using equipment. They're tagging horseshoe crabs down there. In the bottom right is a spawning index survey in the middle of the night. So it was really great. These guys were all about serving, and it was a chance for them to serve more. And then in Rec Pond, we actually have a program where we've trained members of the community to help us do certain things, water quality monitoring, watch the birds that utilize the site. They come in and help out every spring when we come in. We're seining for fish to see what's coming up through the passageway. We get a lot of folks come in and help us do the work. So. And these are. This is a La Mer, which is a high-end cosmetic company. Folks come out from New York, but this is Asiatic Sedge, which is an invasive plant on Sandy Hook, and just teaching them how to remove it, what it looks like, and they come out every year and spend a day with us. We haven't done this in a while, but we used to do a program called Bio Blitzes, where we go on a 24-hour period, how many species can you find, right? And it was really great. Everybody from younger kids to college folks will come out and help us do this, and it just was a great way of trying to take a temperature. And we did them on Sandy Hook mostly. My favorite was there was a young woman from Georgian Court who was so into spiders, I couldn't get her to come out of the basement of my building, right, to help do the surveillance. We said, they're all down here. And then lastly, when we do this work, we always try to make sure that, folks that are elected by their peers, are part of the decision making. So we would have community leaders meetings when we launch these projects, tell them what it's all about, seek their input, and then as the projects are going along, we meet with them regularly. To try to make sure there's a dialogue going on, and particularly down the Delaware Bay, we were driving 50 big dump trucks full of sand through these communities every day when we were building those beaches. So we wanted to make sure the mayor knew what was going on, and if he had or she had any problems, that they would come and contact us. So just I'm going to sum all this up, I guess, in a really big way, right? Doing this work has all sorts of co-benefits, right? It has it contributes to the economy. It keeps the community safe to a certain extent, and in certain types of projects. It minimizes costs in terms of responding to the damage. Has the mitigation aspects of the carbon. So I think this adaptation work is important and needs to be a significant part of how we respond to climate change, how we deal with the issues at hand. But it has to be part of a comprehensive response, right? We have to do the mitigation. We have to shift away from carbon and fossil fuels. And it has to take place at an unprecedented scale. I mean, we really can't, and that's why I say, think about the space race, and because it is so significant and it's so existential that it really can't be something that is ignored to the extent that it is now. I mean, it's really disappointing to watch how the world's leaders respond to it now, even given the science that's given to them regularly. The practices are really, we know how to do a lot of this, right? So it's sort of moving out of that early part of its life and being experimental. And then lastly, which is always what seals the deal for me, is that it connects people back to nature, and hopefully creates that sense of stewardship that I think we're all going to need, because as the T-shirt says, right, there is no planet B. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions about this or about anything else you might have. Oh, but I'm just going to mention now. So Captain Valvajeski is the Habitat Restoration Director. He's the guy who makes all those projects happen, and so he's got he has 6 people who work for him, under him, And they run all those projects, and they are, not only part science, but they're part construction projects, they're part education projects, as you saw. So it's a big job, and I just want to just give him a shout out, because he's the one that makes it work. Right? And he's a really great guy. If you ever get a chance to meet him, he's a great guy, so, okay.
So I have a question, Tim. I just am curious about how you decide which communities to focus on, because I know that a lot of towns, coastal towns and inland towns with rivers and so on, have issues, and as part of that question, does it have to be public lands for it to be eligible for you guys to come in and?
Good question, yeah. So the first part of that, well, the Delaware Bay stuff was driven by where the habitats were, right? So that you had to go where the crabs were, where the birds were. Spring Lake, the Wreck Pond project, which we knew that the herring used that system there. Then the rest of it is becoming more, we're trying to make it more structured. The state is actually running a program called CRAP, which is Coastal Ecological Restoration and Adaptation Program. So we're working with Rutgers University, and I think Monmouth is involved in it. And they're analyzing all sorts of different things, where the wetlands are, what the condition of them are, where there are high erosion rates. So they're trying to be a little more methodical about identifying where those strategic places ought to be that we should be doing the work. So on the public part, yeah, we almost always work on public lands. One, because they're slightly easier to get into, and often the public entities like the DEP or the Fish and Wildlife Service, who runs the National Wildlife Refuges, are looking for partners, right? And we're, at one level, we're bringing millions of dollars, and this is, I think we spent 20-something million so far since Hurricane Sandy on this work. You get into strange liability issues with landowners, and it is. I mean, while I think it's becoming more and more established, it's not always perfect, right? And then people are like, well, you told me you were going to guarantee me this, which we never do. But so it just has been easier to work on the public lands. I think the challenge will be to try to work with the bulkhead companies, bulkhead building companies, and convince them that there are places where they ought to do the living shorelines instead, and then leverage the market so that they're doing the work and they're getting the clientele and convincing them it's the right thing to do.
You had mentioned the bulkheads and the riprap, the use of them. Is one better than the other? Is the riprap? Because I noticed here in Long Branch there's a new project that's going along one of the creeks, and they're going to take the bulkhead down and put riprap up.
Yeah.
And then also I was at Sandy Hook, and I saw that along the bay side, that they put some new riprap there.
Oh, okay. I missed it. Up by the officers' quarter or by the chapel?
No, it's trying to think.
Well, to your question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the riprap, because there's the boulders are piled up and there's spaces for the water to go in. It probably is comparatively a little bit better than the bulkheads, right, which is a flat surface. And again, I talk about all that energy bouncing back off of it. The big open rocks allow it, but it still happens. I mean, my family has a farm down in Chesapeake, my father's place, and both sides of his neighbors, they have a beach on the bay, and he has a natural beach and no structures, right? And both of his neighbors have riprap their edge line, and there's nothing left. Right, the bay water goes right up to the edge of the stuff. So, it's maybe a lesser of two evils, but I don't know that it avoids the problems that I was concerned
Will
with.
that riprap eventually fill in, like through erosion, let's say?
It
And become
usually,
natural?
yeah, and I don't think so, because usually it goes up high enough above the high tide line that natural sediment that might go in, that would happen on a salt marsh, right, that gets inundated twice a day, that's not gonna happen to those walls, so.
Yeah, the beach restoration, sand pumping out here, they've enclosed 2 or 3 streams in Deal, you know, the streams they enclosed. And they were popping up at different places, like you were saying, along the beach. What's your feeling on the pumping, all that sand they pump in there, constantly pumping it, constantly because it's taken out. So our shores seem to go to our sand seems to go to the north, right?
Yeah, runs to the north.
Runs to the north, so stuff they're putting in today could be gone within 3 weeks, right?
Oh, yeah. Or the first storm the day after they finish.
Yeah.
So here's the thing, right? If we want to keep the towns along the edge of Monmouth County on the ocean, you have to do something, right? Because, I mean, think about the Seabright Wall before they put the sand in front of it, right? I'm not a native New Jersey, and the first time I came to New Jersey, I was part of a federal review team. And the guy took me down, and we were on the south end of Seabright, and he stopped the car in the middle of 36. I'm like, what's going on? He says, watch. Boom, big wave comes over the wall, lands in the middle of the highway. He guns it, we run by, and there's another he comes by. So it's a trade-off, and I mean there are definitely environmental consequences to it. That intertidal zone where they fill is a very important forage area for seabirds. It's important for fish. Probably, I think what's going to be even more problematic is where they're taking the sand from offshore, right? Because if you talk to the fishermen, you know, talking about the lumps and Shrewsbury Ridge and the places that they've mowed the sand down, right, to put it onto the beach. Well, all that structure, you know, is not only just a pile of sand, it's also a fish habitat. So there's going to be, it's such a race because, as you said, the sand moves off, right? It ends up in Sandy Hook, ends up in the channel up there. They're increasingly learning to back pass it, so to take it out, take it back to where it started, let it come up again. It's really expensive, but it's better than hard walls. Although, you know, Seabright came in the middle of town and connected the walls there after Sandy. So it is sort of the cost of living as close as we do to the edge of the ocean.
Right.
You know, it has a cost. It's not without cost.
Yeah, you involved with another thing, the oysters behind Swing River. We live on the Swing River, so back in there, in the Tinton Falls, that area in there.
You guys find oysters up that far up there?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
There's oyster shells all over there.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, all back in behind Swing River School,
Yeah.
back in there. Yeah, there's oyster shells all along the shore.
Okay.
We go hiking up there.
I'll have to go check that out.
Yeah, yeah.
We did. I mean, we did a project a couple of years trying to evaluate where there were opportunities to replant oysters, right? And we found some up right by Oyster Point itself, right, and then a couple further down, but not much at all. But you're seeing a lot of
If
them.
you go back in there underneath the 520 Bridge, Normal
Yeah.
Springs, back back
Okay.
beyond that, by Riverdale Avenue East. If you go down Riverdale Avenue East, there's a little bridge right down there. You see them all.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm actually going out with my oyster person tomorrow. I'll mention it to her.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Anybody else?
You were gonna talk a little bit about wind, I think, whether it's good or bad, the wind farms. So we can answer Suzanne's
Yeah,
survey.
well,
Okay.
I know that.
He had a question.
Yeah.
We can do that. We can wrap on that. Then I can.
5 minutes.
How do you get involved in the Earthfield project that
You know, they're up on our website, like all the, so check them out. There's I think that Slade Dale project where they were putting the Christmas trees in, they're gonna do some work there. There's a couple of beach grass plantings that they're gonna do, the restoration staff. But it should all be up by now. Check our website, which is just littoralsociety.org. Or I think it's up on Instagram as well, so. Okay, so wind. You know, wind is another one of these, has good value, good parts to it, but it comes at a cost, right? The only way that we're going to deal with climate change is if we get off of fossil fuels, right? And nobody's given up their iPhones, right? So we have to keep generating electricity. And in fact, you know, when you read the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports and others, there's, you know, you talk about converting everything to electricity that can be sustainably, you know, generated, renewably generated. So if you accept that climate change is as consequential as it is, then you said the only way to deal with it is to shift off of fossil generation. It's either generated through renewables or nuclear. Right? Those are really the only two paths. So on the wind stuff, it'll displace a certain amount of a dependency on fossil fuel generation. It's not going to power every house in New Jersey. Even given, I was reading the petition or the survey, even given the scale of what's being proposed out there, which is fairly large, it'll be some portion of what we need. So it's not the end all and be all to our problem there. It's a lot of structure in the ocean, and nobody really knows yet what the consequences of it are going to be. I was on Governor Cody, it was a while back now, put me on a blue ribbon panel to look at them, and we really couldn't find any science that showed us what the impacts were going to be, because nobody had ever done it before, right? There's a project off of the Netherlands called the Nystad project, and they found there that the fisheries, the assemblages of fish, shifted from ones that were adapted to an open sandy bottom, which is what we have out here now, to ones that were reef fish. Right? Is that an ecological good or an ecological bad? I don't know. It remains to be seen. So, what we've asked and what we've advocated for is responsible siting. So try to figure out where in all that ocean you can put it so it minimizes the impacts on migratory whales, minimizes the impact on migratory birds, doesn't interfere with the commercial fishermen making their livelihood, we have the ability to do that. We have the authorities, we have the laws in place to be able to do that. But there's a lot of pressure, right, to get these things up and get them going, get them leased. The federal agency, I don't think, the BOEM, which is the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, it's not the most responsive, right? Doesn't really, these are the guys that used to permit, they grew up permitting oil development on the Outer Continental Shelf, right? So they're not used to engaging the public or really giving, I don't think, a lot of weight to what the fishermen say or what others say. And that's the problem, because it's that's public trust out there that belongs to the public, and the public ought to be involved in making those decisions. So I think you have to stay on top of it, make sure they're analyzing where it's going to go correctly. One of the handicaps is that there's never been really good baseline work done. I mean, there's some that has been done, but not enough to really inform the placement of these structures. And then monitor them and see what happens. And then it becomes a public. Then it's a policy decision, right? What is the value of displacing the fossil fuel generated power and going to renewables worth whatever it is we might lose? The fishermen are going to lose, right? They're going to lose space. And I know that everybody talks about we're going to be able to sail. They're going to be able to sail and drag in between them. I've talked to them, and they're like, I'm not going to take $100,000 worth of dragging gear in between these pylons, but it might get hung up and lost. So we should all just be honest and say, draw a footprint around those farms and recognize that those are places that they're not going to be able to fish. The recreational fishermen are going to love it, because they're going to be able to go in and tie up, and then which is an artificial reef. So there you go. There's a trade-off, right? There's a balance point. And ultimately, it ought to be a public discussion about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Yeah.
Do we know anything about the life cycle of these things? How long will one live, and then what happens when it's not working anymore? And
Well, they're legally obligated to decommission them, right? They're supposed to take them out once they're done. Whether that means if a storm destroys it, or if it just gets to the end of its useful life or needs to be replaced, then in the licensing of like Ørsted, which is the big Danish company, they're obligated to take them out. That's good. It's good to have that legal protection. I would tell you that some of the oil rigs off of California had the same legal responsibility, and now there's a program called Rigs to Reefs. And so they convinced the California legislature and the feds to let them keep some of them in place. right? So they don't have to take them out. Oh, these are gonna be great artificial reefs, you know, we'll cut them off far enough below the water line that they're not a hazard to navigation anymore, and then we can use them as recreational sites. Again, that, you know, that may be acceptable, but it wasn't what was originally promised. So I don't know what the life cycle is, the lifespan. Is one, they keep changing what kind of windmills they're gonna use, right? You're getting bigger, capable of generating more power per unit, which is good, because then you need fewer of them. If you have a 7,500 megawatt goal, which is what the governor wants to generate out there, then you need fewer big ones, but they're gonna be really big, I mean, like really big. There's great graphics out there, if you ever look for it, where they, you know, they lay a 747 down on, superimpose the blades on it, and the blades are bigger than the 747, you know, that kind of stuff. I mean, they're really big, and it, yeah.
Like Ohio, you see those team out in Ohio?
Yeah.
They're massive, I mean, they're frightening.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. You know, some people love them, some people hate them, depends on how you think about it.
I don't know.
Curious, the thing you said at the end about needing like a space race for, I guess, these projects.
Yeah.
For you guys, what does that ideally look like? Like federal programs, or like how does that happen?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think, well, I guess at one level, sort of like the whole debate about the infrastructure funding that just happened, right? All of a sudden, we're capable of investing trillions of dollars. And you know, the decision makers are assuring us that that's not gonna destroy the economy, that we can do that, right? So that says to me, well, all right, well, if you can do it for just kind of jump-starting the economy, getting things going, why can't we do something at scale like that? I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's like a qualitative assessment that when you read about the consequences, you read like the IPC report that came out earlier this week, you know, it's not something we can wait on. It's not something we can do in a half-assed way, excuse my language, but you know, it has to be really be devoted to. And you know, as I said, I mean, when I grew up during the space race, right, so that was a national commitment to something that had been accepted to be that important to have happen, that all those resources went into it, and we were able to do it. I'm a big believer in American ingenuity, but it has to happen globally, you know. And then the other aspect, of course, is that the people in the nations who suffer the most from the consequences of sea level rise are not the ones that are creating the problem. So you get into a whole wealth redistribution argument about, is the United States, you know, responsible for Kiribati going underwater off in Polynesia? Yes.
Going off the space race question, do you think that actually bringing more light to the monetization and the money-saving aspects of this could get more companies involved in?
Yeah, I think it's persuasive. I do. It's because there are just people. So I often act as a lobbyist, right? I go try to convince people, the government, to do things. You have to meet people where they are, right? So I go talk to the state senator. He may not get the thrill that I get when I hold that red knot in my hand, but he'll understand that bird watching brings $370 million a year into Cape May, which puts people in the hotels, puts them in the restaurants, puts them buying gas, you know. So from a strategy perspective, if you think in numbers and you think in dollars, maybe it's best to talk to you that way, right? Because it's there. Again, as I said earlier, you know, environmentalists didn't think that way, didn't talk that way, but didn't mean that economic value wasn't there nonetheless.
How far offshore will the wind turbines be, like shipping lane distance, or
Sorry?
how far offshore will the wind turbines be, like shipping lane distance? Or?
They're varying distances. I think the closest one is 12 or 11 miles out. Probably 12 to 17 or so. I think it's mostly where, but they just, so it's like a band, I don't know, but it's like a band, right, of big boxes where they're gonna site these things somewhere inside those siting areas. but they just went out and they just leased the next ones out further out into the ocean. So there's gonna be, if they build them, if they end up building them, they'll be 25, 30 miles out sometimes, right? So those will really be out of sight. The ones that are 12, 13 miles out, there's one called the Equinor project is right out in the mouth here, not right out, but it's 13 miles out. You'll be able to see that. It won't be like the ones in Atlantic City. Have you ever seen the ones in Atlantic City? They're not right there, but you're aware of it. And again, you think about it, you can think, oh, well, that's good. That's energy that's not being produced by coal burning. Or other people say, well, it's a wild ocean. We want it to stay a wild ocean. Why can't we do something else? Question is, what else are you going to do, right? What's the alternative? And just to go to your point about money a little bit, I think one of the reasons that the wind will be a primary approach to how we put renewables in place is because there is a lot of money to be made there, and the profit motivation is real, and those guys that are building those things are business people, and a lot of them were in oil production and other sort of dirtier fuels before they got into wind. They got into wind because they saw that there was money to be made, and that's a great motivator. And in this case, it's for something that arguably is for the good.
All right, very good.
Okay.
Well,
All right. Well,
Tim.
thanks for having me.
Thank you
all.
very much.
Thank you very much.
So if, I don't know, Tim, is this presentation available, or is this proprietary, or?
No, Lisa has 4 copies of it.
Well,
Okay.
at
no,
5
you're-
now.
We can make it available if anyone wants to look at a
Yeah,
slide
yeah.
or something. We'll put it on different websites, we'll talk about that. The library might do it, Art4C will probably do it, maybe even the Littoral Society. So thank you very much, appreciate you coming, and I look forward to seeing you at another Art4C event. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.